And let me once again welcome everybody officially to today's online event, Sex Offender Residency Restrictions, Implementation and Impact. Today's event is the first of 4 in our series on sexual violence, which is sponsored by the Government Innovators Network and the National Institute of Justice. Additional event topics will include sexual assault on college campuses, sexual violence and evidence collection, and a discussion about international policy. Those who register for today's event will be notified as subsequent events are scheduled. We anticipate this will be 1 per month through September. And before I hand things over to our moderator, I'd like to begin by issuing this poll. We know that some of you are watching this event from several of you from one computer terminal, so we're trying to get a better sense of that. So if you would, please just click on the answer option that is most appropriate. We have several polling questions to pose to you today, and as the discussion progresses, we'll be administering those. And if you see a polling question pop up, you can just click on the option at your leisure. You don't have to wait for a queue. I'm going to leave that up for about another 5 seconds. And we have a couple of small groups out there. Thanks very much for participating in that poll. And as I said, keep your eye out for additional polls that will come up. But now let me turn things over to today's moderator, Dr. Jill Levinson, who is the Associate Professor of Human Services at Lynn University, the College of Arts and Sciences. She's also a co-investigator on 2 NIJ grants investigating the effectiveness of sex offender registration and notification. Dr. Levinson.
Good afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I wanted to, first of all, welcome you and start today by talking a little bit about the legislative history of residence restrictions. Our purpose today is to talk about the implementation and impact of these kinds of housing laws, and also to talk about mapping technology as a way of understanding the impact of these laws, both on registered sex offenders and also on communities. As most of you are probably aware, sex offender registration began nationally in the U.S. in 1994 with the Jacob Wetterling Act. And in 1996, the federal law was amended to allow for community notification, also known as Megan's Law, which allowed registry information to be disseminated directly to communities, directly to citizens living in communities. And as the public has become more aware of sex offenders living amongst us over the past 10 to 12 years, we have seen an increase in the proliferation of residence restrictions laws. To give you an idea, in 2004, about 14 states had residence restrictions, and here I'm talking about statewide restrictions, a state statute. But by 2007, that number had doubled, partly in response to the murder of Jessica Lunsford. And at this point also, there are hundreds, if not thousands, probably thousands of local jurisdictions across the country, meaning cities, towns, counties, local municipalities, which have local zoning laws. And whereas statewide restrictions tend to be anywhere from about 500 to 2,000 feet, but the average is 1,000. Local municipal ordinances tend to increase those distance buffers, and the most common is 2,500 feet, which is just slightly under a half mile. As you can see, currently there are 30 states across the country which have statewide residence laws. But almost every state has some sort of residence restriction, even if it's a municipal ordinance. The first residence restriction was passed in Florida in 1995, and that was a 1,000-foot condition of probation. Delaware also passed a sex offender housing law in 1995. But as you can see, more than half of these laws have been passed within the past 5 years or so. One question that we might ask is, are residence restrictions effective in achieving some goal? Typically that goal would be construed as preventing recidivism specifically, or reducing sex crimes more generally. And these laws are fairly new, and so there is not a whole lot of research, and it also tends to be methodologically a really difficult question to answer, much more complex than you might imagine. But there is some research out there that gives us an idea. And beginning with the Colorado Department of Public Safety, which in 2004 published this study, and you can find this online at the Department of Public Safety's website. And they tracked 130 sex offenders on probation. 15 of them were rearrested for a new sex crime, and then they mapped those addresses to determine where they lived in proximity to schools and child care centers, and found that recidivists were randomly scattered throughout the geographical area. And there did not seem to be an empirical relationship between proximity to schools and daycare centers and whether or not somebody reoffended or recidivated. So in other words, sex offenders who lived closer to schools or daycare centers were not more likely to be rearrested for a new sex crime. Similarly, the Minnesota Department of Corrections published a report in 2003 where they followed over 300 high-risk sex offenders for a period of years and found that there was a fairly low 4% recidivism rate. And then they looked more closely at those 13 cases to more qualitatively understand where the offenses took place and what kinds of factors were involved. What they found was that none of the offenses occurred near schools or in schools, and although 2 took place near parks, the parks were several miles from the offenders' homes, and they had to drive and use a car to get to the sex crime area. And again, there was a conclusion that residential proximity did not seem to be a factor in recidivism. Again, the Minnesota Department of Corrections did a new study on this issue just recently. They have a published report on their website from 2007, April of last year, and the report was also published in a very prestigious peer-reviewed journal called Criminal Justice and Behavior earlier this year. And they analyzed 224 reoffenses and found that not one would have been prevented by a residence restrictions law. And I would definitely recommend that you read that article. It's probably the most comprehensive study that we have to date on this issue, and was very well done and very informative. So at this point, there really is no research indicating that proximity to schools increases recidivism or that restrictions are successful in preventing sexual abuse, although again it's a fairly complicated topic. At this point, though, I am going to turn the presentation over to Kristen Segovia, and then we will come back a little bit later on in the hour to talk a little bit more about some of the impact and effectiveness and collateral consequences of these laws.
Thanks, Jill. Following up a little bit on what Dr. Levinson said, Jill and I, also with a researcher out of South Carolina, Tracy McKee, decided that it was probably in our best interest to look at sex offender residency restrictions and how that would impact the state of New Jersey. As Jill explained to you, New Jersey is one of the states that has approximately 150 municipal ordinances dealing with sex offender restrictions. We saw a few of them appealed in some of the municipalities, and what we see right now is that other ordinances are arising, and there are other appeal processes occurring. So what we thought we would do is look at Camden County in New Jersey and see how these residency restrictions would affect sex offenders living in this area. So what we decided to do was go to the New Jersey State Police Sex Offender Registry. We looked at all sex offenders who were registered at Camden County on the registry. If anybody is familiar with New Jersey, you know that Tier 1 sex offenders are not going to be listed on the Sex Offender Registry for New Jersey. New Jersey is one of the states that breaks down sex offenders into Tier 1, 2, or 3 based on risk level. So Tier 1 is exempt from being published online. So what we did was take addresses of the 211 sex offenders that were listed on the sex offender registry and map their housing addresses. We used the geographical information system. We actually used ArcView, and ultimately wanted to see how these addresses related to hotspots that many of the residency restrictions deal with. So we looked at how far their addresses were from schools, and those schools included private schools, public schools. We looked at daycare centers, churches, and parks. We looked at 1,000-foot buffers around these areas in relation to the addresses, and then 2,500 feet buffers around these areas. We had about 220 schools. That included, again, the private and public, and this was all of Camden County. Had about 130 daycare centers that were included in Camden County, 38 churches, and about 25 parks in Camden County. So what we did was map all of them using the mapping software. We set our thresholds for validity at about 80% for the addresses. The remainder of the addresses we hand-matched. So we had a pretty high validity level with the addresses. So if I switch over, you'll see the first map. This is Camden County again. If you look at the little square in the upper hand, left-hand corner, you'll see where Camden County falls within New Jersey. It's kind of hard to see from this map, but if you look on the lower left-hand corner, you'll see offender residences mapped, the churches, the daycare centers, the schools, and the parks. And what you'll find are the different buffer zones around them. If you look closely, you'll see the white buffer zone is 1,000 feet buffer, and the grayer area is a 2,500-foot buffer. What we found was that the majority of sex offenders lived within the 2,500 square feet. That translated to 71% of sex offenders lived within the vicinity 2,500 square feet of schools. 80% lived within 2,500 feet of daycare centers. 40% lived within the 2,500 feet of parks, and 18% lived within 2,500 feet of churches. Of course, there were many fewer churches, so that's why the number's a little lower. But 88% of all of the 211 sex offenders lived within 2,500 feet of any of the 4 hotspots that we had designated. So this ultimately put the majority of area in Camden County off limits to the sex offenders. Switching over, comparatively, 80% of non-offending citizens lived within 2,500 feet of such places. So what we had done with that is gone to the U.S. Census. I think we used 2,000 and randomly mapped addresses for Camden County, and we found that 80% of the non-offending citizens lived within these 2,500 feet. So not a statistically significant difference with the sex offenders. We also found that offenders of adult victims lived significantly closer to schools than those who had molested children. Okay, so those who had molested children did not live any closer to schools or daycare centers than those who had assaulted adults. The results suggested that a large majority of the sex offenders would be unable to live in their current homes if residence restrictions were in place, and that ultimately few options for housing exist outside of the common buffer zone. So this would ultimately relegate many of the sex offenders to not being able to live within Camden County. Looking then at the breakdown for the sex offenders living within 1,000 feet of our hotspots and 2,500 feet, and then comparing them to the general population, we see 26% live within 1,000 feet, 37 within 1,000 feet of daycare centers, and 16% within 1,000 feet of parks, and 6% within 1,000 feet of churches. Sex offenders in Camden County living within any hotspot 1,000 feet were about 58%. Okay, this was compared to the general population of individuals in Camden County. About 36% of the general population lived within 1,000 feet of these hotspots. If we switch our buffer zones over to 2,500 feet, we see that that obviously increases the number of sex offenders as well as the general population living within these buffer zones, ranging from a high of 80% near daycare centers to a low of 18% near churches. So we have 88% of the sex offenders in Camden County living within 2,500 feet of any of our hotspots, compared again to the 80% of the general population. The results that we found with our New Jersey study in Camden County, Jill Levinson and I, are very similar to what Cynthia Mercado and one of her research assistants, last name Chajewski, found in the Sex Offender Law Report. They looked at Newark, New Jersey, and plotted very similar hotspots to what we did, and they found that 98% of sex offenders live within 2,500 feet of a school, while 65% live within 1,000 feet. And that 93% of Newark's inhabitable territory is located within 2,500 feet and would therefore be unavailable to sex offenders. So this 93% of inhabitable territory compared to 88% in Camden County, again, not a significant difference between the two urban areas. And what we're finding is that these residency restrictions in urban areas would make living conditions for sex offenders pretty non-existent. We imagine that this would translate to many of the more rural areas, obviously less so. However, we're seeing the greatest impact on the urban areas. So that is all I have, so I imagine that I'll turn it over to Julie.
Thanks, Kristen.
Sure.
So I am coming at it from a slightly different perspective in terms of being a practitioner and also looking at how the law was going to affect us. And we'll start right in here. So in last year, in 2007, Proposition 83, also known as Jessica's Law, California had it on the ballot in November. So last fall, we as a county started looking at what was the effect going to be in terms of housing and where did the current registrants live. In California's Proposition 83, it says 2,000 feet from a school or park where children gather. The where children gather, as I put in quotes, is questionable and hard to define, as we all know, but that's what we were given to work with. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the San Diego County process, and it was led by myself at the DA's office, but it was collaborative and looking at the entire county. And I had a little chuckle, Kristen, talking about looking at 200 or so offenders and 200 or so schools. We have about 3,500 offenders in San Diego County and about 900 schools and several hundred parks. So everything is multiplied in terms of trying to, get good addresses, etc. And then I want to just finish with mapping and analysis as collaborative tools and what we did and how we can learn from what we did and hopefully go forward in the future. So the San Diego County methodology, it's really about data. As anyone that's done any mapping is aware that, garbage in, garbage out, and if the data is not there, you spend an awful lot of time finding it, cleaning it, etc. And then what types of questions you ask about your data is the analysis that you need to do. So we started with, we had school points. They existed. They come from the California Department of Education, and our county uses those and works with those every year. We added on Megan's Law, the current PC, Penal Code 290, or Megan's Law registrants, which is California's law, just to look at where do the existing registrants live in relation to where are the school addresses. We then went to school polygons, as the law is about a school property, not about the address. And again, as we all know, that several schools can be a lot larger than that single address. So if we're looking at 2,000 feet around a school property versus a school address, it makes it even bigger. We created those by taking the points and matching them to parcels. We then went to parks, and again, 2 years later, we still are working on a real park layer. everyone has a different definition of parks, and then if you add in where children gather, it even makes it a little more confusing. McDonald's Playland could be a park where children gather, neighborhood grassy areas, all of that. So for the purposes last fall, because we didn't have those definitions, we used a land use layer that is maintained by the San Diego Association of Governments, and we just picked them based on active park or active beach, and we used those parcels. The next data layer that we looked at, and this was taking it a next step of where is, as Kristen mentioned, inhabitable land, as the Newark study looked at. We used the tax assessor parcel layer. That existed. What we needed to do was extract out residential parcels, because as you'll see in the upcoming map, San Diego County has a lot of open space. And we could look at the map that way and say, oh, there's plenty of places to live, or we can look and see what are residential parcels. We created the buffers, the 2,000-foot buffers around the schools and parks, and we made a series of maps, and then we did some analysis on the results, including the residential parcels. So what you see here is a lot of red. So the blue spots are the school properties, the green spots are parks, and the red are the 2,000-foot buffers. And again, in the urban areas, and to put you in perspective, down below the map is Mexico. San Diego County ends at the Mexican border. So we have a couple of small cities down there, National City and Chula Vista, and we go up through Camp Pendleton is on the north end of San Diego County. Out east is Borrego Springs, is that big open area. So a lot of the urban area was covered by this, and a lot of the open area, as we found, was not did not have residential parcels. So our analysis ultimately was that we had 27% of all residential parcels would be available to live. And that varied, of course, across cities and neighborhoods. So in conclusion, just wanted to kind of talk about how we work together well at the county level, and that this could be done by others in the future, and also at state levels if the state is going to pass laws and attempt to implement restrictions. So acquiring and developing the data was a vital element. California Department of Justice is who maintains our Megan's Law sex registrants. California Department of Education with the schools. California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, we worked closely with them as we continue to, because they are currently the only ones enforcing the Proposition 83. The remainder of law enforcement in the state, it's held up in court at this point. San Diego Association of Governments, we have a local GIS data warehouse called SanGIS, and then we also use various people throughout the county, GIS experts. Next part, doing the analysis, just got to figure out what questions that we need answered. We created a model, San Diego PD and myself, so other jurisdictions, San Diego PD, or the City of San Diego was talking about, local ordinance, the county, a couple other cities, so that they could just plug in their data and create similar maps and analyses. We looked at buffering to see counts of the areas or the hotspots, as Kristen referred to them, the most people that lived currently closest to schools and parks. And then we did the residential parcel analysis. We're hoping not only here in San Diego County and in California, but elsewhere, that we can use GIS and mapping and analysis to improve legislation, help educate the public, and assist other jurisdictions. And I will turn that over to Tim now.
Thank you, Julie. I'd also like to thank Jim for putting together the panel. I think it's a good panel, and I look forward to the subsequent panels. The information that I'm going to present today is a brief description of findings from research that Paul Zandbergen and I conducted, and that was published in 2006 in Justice, Research, and Policy. And the title of our article is Reducing Housing Options for Convicted Sex Offenders, Investigating the Impact of Residency Restriction Laws Using GIS. When Paul and I began our work, we were aware of previous research in this area that looked at some of the unintended consequences of sex offender registration and notification laws. For example, we knew of research that showed how these types of laws could produce public anxiety and retaliation, harassment, stigmatization, and retribution, and could actually result in an increase rather than a decrease in the likelihood of reoffending. Other findings that guided what we were doing were produced from studies like the Colorado study that suggested that there wasn't necessarily a strong relationship between reoffending and sex offenders' residential proximity to places where children congregate. But the question for us that remained sort of unanswered was what sort of unintended consequences do residency restriction laws produce, if any? We felt that sort of the first step in answering this sort of question would involve quantifying the impact of these laws in terms of how they affected or limited where sex offenders could establish residence. So for our study, we sought to answer the question, to what degree do residency restriction laws limit the possibilities of where sex offenders may establish residence? We began our investigation by collecting data from a variety of sources, both from the state and local, resources in Florida and Orange County, respectively, and that were consistent with the different components of Florida law at that time. For example, since we were going to analyze our data using GIS or mapping software, we obtained parcel data similar to what Julie was describing for land in Orange County, and our study focused on Orange County. This information not only contained information about addresses, but also zoning information. We also obtained information regarding schools, daycare centers, parks and playgrounds, attractions, and bus stops. Again, these were all components mentioned in the Florida legislation. The method we chose involved a simple mapping technique in GIS called buffering, like Julie described. And this slide illustrates the technique. And what it shows is, in the center, a large parcel of land where a school was located. That's the dark gray area. Let's see here, this area here. And our analysis involved plotting a 1,000-foot buffer around that parcel and identifying all the parcels contained within that 1,000-foot buffer. We also analyzed the data using a 2,500-foot buffer, since at the time of our analysis, Florida legislators were considering increasing the distance statewide from 1,000 feet to 2,500 feet. Finally, what we did is we looked at the different impact that each of the restricted areas had in terms of the parcels that fell within the buffer distance from those areas. And the next slide is a table that presents some of our findings. The top half of the table represents the results of our analysis for the 1,000-foot restriction, and the bottom half is the same information, but based on analysis of 2,500-foot buffers. And what we found was that at the 1,000-foot buffer distance, that Florida's residency restriction law limited sex offenders to only about 5% of the parcels in the county that were zoned for residential use. And that most of the available living area is in rural areas of the county. We also found that given the distribution throughout the county, that bus stops had a greater influence or impact on where sex offenders could reside within the county relative to the other restrictive categories that we looked at. Here is all of the within the 1,000 foot buffer distance, just over 95% of the parcels zoned for residential use were areas in which sex offenders could not live. And something to keep in mind, this is a high end in terms of an estimate because we did not take into consideration vacancy information, which was not available. So this is just the potential livable area. When we increased the restrictive distance to 2,500 feet, this resulted in nearly a complete elimination of any parcels available for residents to sex offenders. 99.7% of all residentially zoned parcels fell within a 2,500 foot buffer of restrictive categories examined. The next slide visually represents our findings. Again, this is our analysis was conducted in Orange County. This area sort of is the Orlando area. I-4 kind of runs here, just to orient you to what's shown. The cross-hatched areas are water features. In terms of our findings, the black areas, such as this area down in here, represent parcels that fall outside a 2,500 foot buffer. And keep in mind, this only represents about 0.3% of all residentially zoned parcels in the county. And the medium gray colored areas fall outside like this area here, fall outside a 1,000 foot buffer, or represent about 4.8% of all the residentially zoned parcels in the county. So based on our study, our findings, we concluded that housing options for sex offenders within urban residential areas such as Orange County, Florida, are severely limited, and that different types of restrictive places affect housing options differently. In our case study, again, just in Orange County, we also found that residency restriction laws push sex offenders into low-density rural areas, which could result in limiting access to things like treatment programs. It could complicate probation requirements, decrease supervision, diminish various support structures, and access to things such as that. And although we did not specifically address it in our study, we suggested that limiting housing options for sex offenders could actually lead to an increase in offending by virtue of these unintended consequences. At the time, we encouraged future research to begin taking a closer look at the relationship between residency restriction laws and reoffending, and are glad to see some of the studies, such as the information just released by Tewksbury and colleagues, that address this particular aspect of the problem. And I believe I'm turning it back over to Jim.
Actually, I'll let Jill Levinson take over.
Sorry.
Okay. Thank you. I wanted to follow up on that by talking just a little bit about unintended consequences of residence restrictions. And to start, just by contextualizing it in terms of what we know from really, decades of criminological literature. What does the criminal justice literature tell us about transience and recidivism? How does housing stability impact community reentry and successful reintegration for criminal offenders in general? And there are several studies that support pretty strongly the idea that residential instability is a predictor of decreased or increased recidivism rather, and interferes with the ability to successfully reintegrate. So for example, in Georgia, residential instability was a robust predictor of reoffending, and the likelihood of a rearrest increased 25% each time a parolee moves. Likewise, released prisoners living in shelters in New York were more likely to abuse substances, to be unemployed, and to abscond from supervision. Unstable living arrangements was the strongest predictor of absconding in a sample of over 4,000 criminal offenders in California. And similarly, in a national sample of over 2,000, probationers who moved more than once during probation were almost twice as likely to have had a disciplinary hearing or some kind of parole violation. So transience clearly interferes with successful reintegration, and laws such as residence restrictions that decrease stability may inadvertently increase the likelihood of recidivism. Maybe not necessarily sex offense recidivism, but general recidivism. We know that housing and property ownership are actually related to decreased recidivism because they contribute to the development of social bonds, sometimes what is called social capital. And this facilitates crime desistance because people are able to develop a network of pro-social activities and pro-social peers and kind of reinforce their sense of investment in community and a non-deviant identity. So criminal offenders who return to communities do need some ability to socialize with other people who are engaged in law-abiding activities and to feel invested in conformity with social norms. And what research tells us is that housing, employment, supportive social relationships, particularly marriage, are consistently linked to desistance from crime. And on the other hand, lifestyle instability is a risk factor for both general and sexual recidivism, for general criminal offenders and also for sex offenders. Sex offenders who have positive social supports in their life are less likely to reoffend or to violate probation. So in some ways, residence restrictions are almost counterintuitive, even though they sound like a good idea in theory. If we keep sex offenders from living within places where they have close access to children or potential victims, that will prevent them from reoffending. On the other hand, what a large body of research is telling us is that housing instability and the subsequent disengagement from family and the community actually increases the risk for recidivism. I've done a series of studies looking at the potential collateral consequences of residence restrictions. And what you're seeing here is a chart that outlines the different kinds of consequences reported by sex offenders in 3 different jurisdictions at 3 different times. And certainly there are limits to self-report data. These are surveys and interviews with sex offenders who were asked to report the incidence of these kinds of consequences, and so the reliability of self-report data may not be as high as relying on other kinds of official documentation. However, it is one piece of information that helps us understand how offenders are impacted. The red line represents data that was collected in Florida in 2004, and the study was published in 2005. The data were collected from sex offenders in treatment in Fort Lauderdale and Tampa. And at the time of the data collection in 2004, Florida had a 1,000-foot restriction that applied only to sex offenders on probation. I did a follow-up on that in Florida with data collected in 2006, and that article just came out this month in Criminal Justice Studies. And that was a survey of 109 sex offenders living in Broward County, Florida, which is the greater Fort Lauderdale area. And again, the data was collected in 2006, which was after about 26 of the independent cities in Broward County had implemented local municipal ordinances, most often 2,500 feet. So the two, and that's the purple line that you see. So those 2 sets of data represent 1,000-foot buffers and 2,500-foot buffers. And then finally, the orange line is data collected from sex offenders in treatment programs in Indiana, and that data was collected in 2005, and Indiana has a 1,000-foot statewide residence zone. And so what we see is by far the consequences seem to be increased in the purple line, which is sex offenders from Florida who were subject to 2,500-foot restrictions. And you can see there was a vast array of different types of consequences, having to move, being unable to return home, unable to live with family, financial kinds of consequences, most often from sometimes having to move multiple times and take time off from work to do so, come up with first month's rent and security deposits, landlords refusing to rent or renew leases, and then towards the bottom a series of questions about what we term psychosocial consequences, hopelessness, anger, depression, and some practical consequences like having to live farther from support systems, social services, treatment, employment, and public transportation. This is a similar study that was done in New Jersey that surveyed 137 registered sex offenders in New Jersey, and again, various categories of different types of consequences, including financial hardships, psychosocial or anger, hopelessness types of responses, living farther from employment, 40%, farther from social services, 26%, farther away from family and friends, 41%, and 10% responding that they do believe that residence restrictions help prevent sex offending. So the majority feeling that residence restrictions were not very effective in helping them to prevent offending. In Broward County, which is the Fort Lauderdale area, what we found was, with the 2,500-foot laws, a real increase in transients and homelessness. So 39% reported being homeless for 2 or more days at a time. That didn't necessarily mean that they were living under a bridge or on the street, but that they did not have a home of their own because they could not find one that met requirements. The average number of moves for these offenders since they had been registered was 2, having to relocate, but 22% reported that they had to relocate 3 or more times. Once again, 3/4 saying that they would be able to reoffend despite residence restrictions, not believing that these laws are very effective in protecting children. Similar to what Van Bergen and Hart found, these offenders who were surveyed did report that bus stops seemed to be by far the most restrictive type of venue, and probably because there are so many of them. Schools coming next. In Florida also, where practically there is not an apartment complex or a hotel in the entire state that doesn't have a swimming pool, these offenders were also finding that swimming pools were considered by some probation officers to be a place where children congregate. And that was another venue that made it difficult to find housing that met compliance. This chart, basically what this chart does is look at the empirical relationship or the correlation between certain types of characteristics and certain types of consequences. And again, this is data that comes from the Florida sample from 2006. And one interesting finding was in the first column when we look at offender age, here we can see that most of these are statistically significant, and that is designated by the stars or the asterisks. And what this means is that the younger an offender was, the more likely they were to experience any or really all of these types of consequences. And so younger offenders, young adults who may not really be financially or emotionally prepared to live on their own, who were not allowed to live with their parents because they lived in a residential neighborhood that was too close to some kind of prohibited venue. We found that all of the consequences really were more dire for younger offenders. Some other things that were significantly correlated, income or lower income related to spending more time in jail due to a residence violation. And over here we see that the proximity zone was related to increased consequences. So the larger the zone that somebody was subjected to, the more likely they were to have to move out of a rental, to spend more time homeless, and to live farther away from employment. Similarly, in Indiana, we also found that age was inversely correlated with some negative consequences, so younger offenders were more likely to experience those kinds of consequences. And this has some implications in terms of the newly implemented Adam Walsh Act, the federal guidelines, which allow or require really youth as young as 14 years old to be registered as sex offenders if they commit a sex crime, even if they are adjudicated delinquent in a juvenile justice system. And so because many residence restrictions laws are tied to registration status, we may see an increased population of youth who are unable to live with their parents in residential neighborhoods or communities and are going to be increasingly having difficulty finding residences that meet compliance with residence restrictions laws. This was what I thought was kind of an interesting poll done by CNN about a year ago when sex offenders living under bridges in Miami were getting a lot of national news attention. And so they did a poll on their website asking the public to whether or not it's okay to have laws that mean that child sex offenders cannot legally live anywhere. And as you can see, they got almost 70,000 votes. And by a small margin, the majority of people did not think that these laws were fair. Almost split in half, but with a slight majority indicating no. So whereas it seems that registration and community notification have almost overwhelming support by the public in the 80s and 90% when people are surveyed, residence restrictions have somewhat lower popularity. This is another community survey of people in the community, and as you can see, 83% indicating that they believe that community notification reduces sex offenses, but 58% indicating that restricting where sex offenders can live will reduce sex offending. However, 73%, three-quarters, did say that they would support these policies even if there was no scientific evidence of their effectiveness. There have been some responses to residence restrictions by some kind of unlikely allies, interestingly. In Iowa, which implemented a 2,000-foot statewide restriction, which ended up leading to increases in homelessness and transients, the Iowa County Attorneys Association, which is the statewide association of prosecutors, did issue a public statement, and this can be found online. We can provide the link if anybody's interested. But they did issue a public position statement calling to rescind the law, documenting damage to the reliability of the sex offender registry and the lack of research indicating that these laws have a protective effect, feeling that the number of sex offenders that are included is too broad for people who pose no known risk in covered locations. Also, interestingly, they suggested that these laws have created a decline in confessions and plea agreements, overwhelming the justice system with trials and leading to some sex offenses not being dropped, charges being dropped, and some sex offenders going then without punishment and without treatment. The National Alliance to End Sexual Violence has also issued a public statement in opposition, as has the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and here are some websites with those statements. So at this point, I am going to turn the show over to the audience participation, and we can present other types of data in the context of the audience questions, but at this point I will ask Jim to help us turn over to audience question and answers.
Thanks, Dr. Levinson. If you go to, have you clicked the Question Manager button yet to see some of the questions that are in the queue?
Yes. Okay.
And so you can, if you like, you can just scroll through those and ask whichever ones are you find most compelling and fire away.
Okay. Here's a question. Should I announce who is asking the question?
You can if you want, but it's not necessary.
Okay. Here's a question about leaders in my city are concerned about legal challenges to an ordinance that would restrict the residency of sex offenders. What types of legal challenges have been filed to date? Would anybody on the panel like to answer that question about the various legal challenges and legal opinions?
I'd be happy to talk about California in that there have been legal challenges. It's actually in the California Supreme Court right now, both the 2,000-foot restriction as well as the mandatory GPS tracking.
And that has not been decided yet.
Correct.
Yeah.
So currently, California Department of Corrections parole is enforcing it, but once they are off parole, the sex offenders or the sex registrants are off parole, no local law enforcement is enforcing it at this point.
There have been several lawsuits, some at the state levels and some at the local levels. There's also a challenge pending in New Jersey, which I believe is in the Court of Appeals, that resulted from two ordinances, local ordinances. That was sort of unique because New Jersey's state Megan's law does have a clause saying that registration status cannot be used to deny housing or other accommodations. So some of the state challenges have been very specific to kind of state issues. There was also there have been several lawsuits, one in Ohio which was successful, which related primarily to property ownership, an ex post facto case, I believe, that people could not be asked to leave a home that they owned after residence restrictions went into effect. People may be familiar with the with the Georgia ruling. Georgia passed a statewide law 2 years ago restricting sex offenders from living or working within, I believe it was 2,000 feet. And that was challenged, and again, that seemed to be interpreted very narrowly to apply only for property owners. So I believe that there are several attorneys participating today, so I would encourage you all to chat with each other, perhaps afterwards in the chat room, and swap information about legal challenges.
And those two townships in New Jersey are Galloway Township and Lower Township that have upheld the appeal process, so similar to what you said, Jill.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I see another question, too, regarding statistics about whether crime rates have decreased in areas prior to sex offenders residing in the area and after sex offenders have moved into an area. And I believe that Richard Tewksbury published a study recently, and again we can get some of these citations for you, saying that the number of sex offenders living in an area was not related to the sex crime rates in that particular jurisdiction. I know that some of the questions, as I'm looking at them, are asking questions about statistics in a particular jurisdiction, and maybe we can go through those later to help hook people up with resources in their local communities where they might be able to obtain some of that data. There's a question about loitering laws, and let me talk about that for a moment. Some of the alternatives to residence restrictions in some states and also local jurisdictions have been loitering zones or child safety zones. And these are laws that prohibit sex offenders from loitering or hanging out in places where they can cultivate relationships with children or groom them. And usually they are distance buffers, sometimes 300 feet, sometimes 500 feet. And what it says is that the offender cannot loiter within, say, 300 feet of a place where children congregate without prior permission or a legitimate reason. So most of these laws, and there are a handful of them around the country, they have exclusions for a sex offender who might, for instance, have to pick up his own child from school or be somewhere at a particular time for some legitimate reason. But it prevents them from just hanging around in a place where children might be, an arcade, a park, etc. And really, these laws, I think, are a nice alternative because they're more palatable from the point of view of they don't restrict where sex offenders reside, but they probably are more useful in terms of managing risk on a day-to-day basis keeping sex offenders from actually, who may be predisposed to being attracted to children and predatory toward children. It keeps them from being able to go to places where they might be able to interact with children and potentially abuse or groom them for abuse. Would anybody like to add anything to that? The irony of residence restrictions is that they tend to really regulate where sex offenders sleep at night primarily, but most of them do not regulate where sex offenders can go or be present during waking hours when children are in schools or at bus stops. And so loitering zones may be more useful in terms of actually restricting interaction between potential predators and vulnerable children.
Jill, this is Julie again. I'd like to add that it could be also based on, at least in California and several other jurisdictions, we have gang injunction laws that we can set an area where specific gang members are not allowed to do certain activities, and that could be enforced similarly.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, Julie, that answers somebody else's question, and I could ask you to expand on this if you can. The question is there any other criminal population that is subject to residence restrictions?
The gang injunctions actually don't have residency restrictions. The injunctions are specific areas where, and there's a laundry list of all the things that they're not allowed to do, and it depends on, each injunction is specific, and it's not anyone in the gang. Each person, at least in San Diego County, each person has to be named, and it's everything from hanging out on a street corner with 3 other people that might be in the gang, whereas that's legal if you weren't on the injunction. That could be specified in the injunction. So I would say that, and the gang injunction violations are punishable by, I believe, a $1,000 fine and up to a year in jail, just for a violation of the injunction versus any other crime that's being committed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I know that the first local ordinances which was enacted, the first local ordinance which was enacted in Miami Beach in 2005, was actually fashioned after zoning laws that prohibit adult establishments from operating within 2,500 feet of schools. So, in other words, strip clubs or porn stores or sex clubs were not allowed to operate within 2,500 feet of schools, and that was sort of the impetus for the first local zoning ordinance here in Florida. And I also believe that at the federal level, I think that criminal offenders in general, many types of criminal offenders, are prohibited from residing in public housing. They cannot obtain public housing benefits. So there are, in some limited ways, restrictions, and there are also laws, I believe, on drug dealers, but I'm not sure that those laws pertain, I shouldn't say I'm not sure. Those laws don't pertain quite as strictly as they do to sex offenders. I wanted to also answer some questions about recidivism rates, which had come up, and I'm going to refer here to pull up some other slides. And we just saw a poll. Can we go back to that poll for a second, Jim? Okay, so the audience was just asked what percentage of convicted sex offenders reoffend, and we see that the majority of answers were in that 5 to 25% range, and that is the correct answer. You all win $1 million. And then there were some other answers scattered throughout with some more extensive percentages, 40%, 60%. You all obviously are well informed, as well you should be since you're working in this field, compared to the public, which does tend to believe in general that sex offenders tend to recidivate at much higher rates. And so the truth is that recidivism rates are much lower than commonly believed. Part of the impetus for these laws is that sex offenders have higher rates of recidivism than other criminals in general, and that they are extremely dangerous. And certainly that is true for some sex offenders. Across the board, however, some of the largest studies that we have are one from the Department of Justice, which was published in 2003, which tracked over 9,000 sex offenders who were released from prison, and found that slightly over 5% of them were rearrested for a new sex crime over a period of 3 years. A Canadian study, which was actually an international sample of Canadian, European, and American sex offenders. Sample size was originally over 29,000 sex offenders who were followed over 4 to 6 years, and that study found that about 14% of the sex offenders were rearrested for a new sex crime over that follow-up period. There is also a longer-term study. It would be this one, Hansen and Harris, 2004. Again, these are Canadian researchers, and this study can be found on the website of the Solicitor General's Office of Canada. And they studied a sample size of almost 5,000 sex offenders over a long-term follow-up period of 15 years, and found that the average recidivism rate was 24%. So 24% of 4,700 sex offenders were rearrested for some kind of sex crime over a 15-year period. And that's a pretty long follow-up period. And as we can see, what they also found, I know this is a little hard to read, it's a little on the small side, but child molesters with boy victims, consistently throughout the literature, they have the highest recidivism rates. We see here in this long-term study 35%. Rapists were about the same as the average. Molesters of girl victims, slightly lower than the average, and incestuous molesters, even though that's obviously a very egregious offense, statistically tend to have lower recidivism rates than those who molest children outside of the family. Let me go back to the questions. There were some questions also about loitering laws. One asking, have the loitering laws been challenged? Not to my knowledge. And another question asking, who currently has a loitering zone law that people could look at as an example to review. I know that Hillsborough County, Florida, has a loitering law, and they elected to pass that in lieu of a county-wide residence restriction. And so that might be one to look at. I also heard recently about a website. I haven't actually tried it out, but I think it's called municode.com or .org, MUNICODE, which apparently is a website where people can look up municipal codes or municipal laws. So that might be a resource as well.
Oh, that's a great resource.
Jill,
Yes.
since we're also sort of back on the statistics topic, I also wanted to throw out there that if you're interested in finding more information about what's available to your state, a really good place to start would be the state SAC. If you go to jrsa.org, the Justice Research and Statistics Association, there will be a contact for someone in your state, for every state, that probably has a handle on who's doing what in the state in this area. So again, jrsa.org would probably be a good place to start if you're interested in these kind of statistics for your area.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody asking a question about a National Registration Act, and for those of you who may not be aware of the Walsh Act, which is at the federal level, a new law that was passed that modified the Jacob Wetterling Act, was passed in 2006, which refined the guidelines for states to implement sex offender registration and community notification strategies or laws. So for those of you who are interested in the new current national guidelines for sex offender registration and notification, There are several websites you could go to. If you go to Google and type in SMART Office, S-M-A-R-T, you can get to their website. The SMART Office stands for Sex Offender Monitoring, Apprehension, Registration, and Tracking, I believe, and that is the federal office that is managing the implementation of the new federal guidelines. And they have a lot of information on their website, including information about a symposium that will occur at the end of July. I believe it begins on July 29th or July 30th, where there will be, it's a conference that will discuss the new guidelines and how the states are implementing them. So for people interested in national guidelines with regard to registration and notification, that's a good resource for that. Okay, and I can see that Jim is accessing that on your screen as we speak. I see a question about what we call clustering. Have there been studies that have found that multiple sex offenders living together in one location have increased or decreased recidivism? And that's an interesting question because with the increase in residence restrictions laws and the fact that they greatly diminish housing availability, what that means is that sex offenders do end up clustering in certain areas of a town or city and county. Some of these areas have gotten a lot of publicity. There was the city of Long Beach, California, for instance, recently came to attention because there were a great number of sex offenders living in a particular apartment complex, which I guess was outside of the restriction zones in California of 2,000 feet. And it was on the Dr. Phil show. Residents were very upset that all of these sex offenders were living in one place. That's one of the unintended consequences of residence laws, is that when residential zoning means that the availability of properties is diminished, then obviously the sex offender is going to move to the area where the properties are available. So in terms of the question of does clustering increase or decrease recidivism, I would draw your attention again to the Colorado study, which I discussed before and can be found on the website of the Colorado Department of Public Safety. In their study, which was published in 2004 about residential proximity, they also addressed the question of what they called shared living arrangements and whether or not sex offenders who lived together were more likely to recidivate. And interestingly, what they found was that sex offenders who lived in these kinds of supportive living environments were less likely to recidivate because they kind of policed themselves. They were more likely to alert authorities or probation agents when somebody was engaging in high-risk activity. And so it was almost as though they felt like if one sex offender reoffended, that would make everybody else look bad. And so they were more likely to kind of police each other as well as providing support to each other. So contrary to the perhaps assumption that multiple sex offenders in one dwelling or in one location increases risk, it may actually be that the opposite is true. But the research on that is very limited so far, as is the research on residential proximity. And so we are still at the very early stages of research in this area.
Jill, let me just add that while New Jersey doesn't appear to have any research specific to clustering or the recidivism that may result from clustering, what we do find when we geographically search for our sex offenders, we see clusters of sex offenders living around the state and county correctional facilities that they've been released from. So what we'll find is in many of the mobile home communities, we might have 2-3 sex offenders living in one apartment, one house, one mobile home, things of that nature. So while we haven't found any specific increases in recidivism around those areas, we do find significant clustering.
Thank you. Kristen, I also would like to ask you to speak a little bit about risk assessment and tiering. The question here is, what can one person do, or the question is about trying to help their political establishments create a focus on only those who present the highest danger to reoffend. And again, before I turn over to you, Kristen, I would just say for clarity's sake, about half of the states slightly less than half of the states do use a risk classification system where sex offenders are categorized into tiers. Level 1, Level 2, Tier 1, Tier 2, an idea of higher risk versus low risk. However, more than half of the states have what is called broad registration and notification policies, in that there is no assessment of risk, and all sex offenders are equally likely or equally subjected to registration and notification kinds of laws. So, Kristen, maybe you can speak to New Jersey as one example, and I believe also California. Julie can answer too about the risk assessment process and the tiering classification.
Sure. I don't know too much on the risk assessment tiering, but ultimately what happens prior to a sex offender's release in New Jersey, the sex offender's risk assessment is completed usually at the prosecutor's office for the county in which the sex offender will be released to. And I believe that is the static 99 or the razor or a combination thereof. And the prosecutor's offices then complete these actuarial risk assessments, placing the sex offenders in one of three tiers. Tier 1 being the lowest proposed risk and Tier 3 being the highest proposed risk. In New Jersey, only Tiers 2 and 3 are placed on our sex offender registry. Tiers 1, only the police departments, local daycare centers, schools, only they know about the sex offenders who were considered Tier 1. And then again, Tier 3 is the highest risk where anybody could log on to the sex offender registry, look through it, and also go to their local police departments. For New Jersey, Tier 3 being the highest risk is also the smallest category. We have approximately 350 sex offenders in New Jersey who are considered a Tier 3 or the highest risk of sex offenders. New Jersey State Parole Board has recently started a number of pilot studies where they've monitor their Tier 3 sex offenders with GPS, the global positioning satellites, to see ultimately whether or not that would decrease recidivism. They've released some recent studies showing that only one sex offender who was considered a Tier 3 with a GPS system recidivated. So ultimately this is the way the sex offenders are tiered in New Jersey. So there are very few studies nationwide as well as in New Jersey that link different tiers to different levels of recidivism, only because it's very difficult to call into question things like supervision, community notification. Ultimately, how you measure those variations becomes very difficult. So, again, I've seen very few studies measuring that. Thanks, Jill.
And I can jump in about California. I will ditto. I'm not sure about studies, but in terms of classifications, the California Department of Justice for the public website also has 3 classifications. And how that plays out for information to the public is that the lowest level, there's a list. You can just get them on a list without a dot on the map. Or the middle level is that you'll see, you can run it by zip code and find out what zip code the person lives in. And then the highest would be full amount of information with the dot on the map of where they live. Secondly, the Department of Corrections Parole also has a high-risk sex offender category, and those are the sex offenders on parole supervision that all have GPS anklets on them as part of a project that started about 3 or 4 years ago.
Okay, thank you. Okay, just a couple clarifications. People are messaging me. The Georgia law is 1,000 feet, not 2,000 feet. I apologize, I misspoke. And so that is a correction. And I had another correction here too, which is no, I can't find it. I apologize. That New York, Suffolk County, New York also has a loitering zone for those people who were interested in looking at samples of loitering zones. So thank you to the person who let us know that. Getting back to the question of recidivism rates, because there are several questions about that. And some of the questions are also about how to, sort of speak to legislators about this or to recommend how to implement risk assessment procedures in different states. And so let me talk about that for just a minute, and I'll defer to the rest of the panel as well. Certainly, we, as citizens, as parents, as women, as all of us, I think, can agree that there's a consensus that children need to be protected from sexual predators. All of us, I'm sure, could agree that our goal is to reduce sexual violence. I think that where the disagreements occur is in the question of what is the best strategy to accomplish that goal. And as social scientists, I think that we should be advocating for policies that are based on the evidence that we have. And certainly the evidence is not perfect. The research in this particular field is still somewhat new, but to work with what we do have. And so our community strategies to help all of us live in safer communities, prevent recidivism, reduce sex crime rates in general, will probably be most effective when they are informed by scientific data about recidivism risk assessment, the needs of criminal offenders and reintegration, the types of therapeutic interventions that work, and the types of community management strategies that work. Along those lines, with people who were asking about risk assessment, and we've heard from a couple states that do have them, there are several empirically derived and validated risk assessment instruments, the most popular one being probably the Static 99. For those of you who are familiar with psychosexual assessments or sexually violent predator assessments, you will probably recognize the Static 99, which is a 10-item actuarial instrument which is able to screen sex offenders into relative risk categories and assess the likelihood that they will be rearrested for a new sex crime over some follow-up period of time. And California, I believe, does use the Static 99 in their classification system. These types of instruments are developed or were developed through first identifying the risk factors that are associated with sex offense recidivism. It's a similar process that your car insurance company went through, or the insurance industry in general has gone through in order to figure out how to set our premium rates. What they do is they are able to classify people into relative risk categories depending on certain types of characteristics or risk factors that they may have. And so, for example, when you go to your doctor, he may ask you about whether you smoke, are you overweight, do you have high blood pressure, do you have high cholesterol, and all of those are risk factors for a heart attack. And by factoring those items together, you can estimate your likelihood of having a heart attack. Similarly, your car insurance company can estimate your likelihood of having an accident. Can they predict that you will have an accident next year? No. But if you are a 17-year-old boy who had a ticket and an accident in the last year, you're going to fall into a high-risk category because that's the group that's most likely to cost the insurance company money. This is similar to how risk assessment classification systems have been derived in criminal justice settings, looking at the likelihood of recidivism. We can't predict that some particular offender will commit another crime, but what we can do is look at the different characteristics and historical risk factors that they have and establish whether or not they are similar to other offenders who have gone on to commit subsequent new sex crimes after a prior conviction. So that's a little bit about how these risk assessment classification systems are created and developed. And this instrument, the Static 99, is probably the most popular, most used, and well-validated risk assessment instrument. And on the other side, though, is that the new Adam Walsh Act created what is really an offense-based classification system rather than a risk-based classification system. And those are really two different types of categorization systems. An offense-based classification looks at the statute under which a person was convicted, and there may be some logical way of saying that some crimes are more severe than others, and then classifying the offenders according to the severity of the crime that was committed. However, a risk assessment system actually looks at the characteristics of the offender regardless of the type of offense that they were convicted of, and again uses those characteristics to assess the person's similarity to other people who are known to go on and recidivate. And so one suggestion would be that there are empirically based tools out there that can be used to try and identify high-risk offenders. And in terms of resource allocation and minimization of collateral consequences, it is probably not a bad idea for for states or systems to move in the direction of risk assessment, to target pooling their resources with the most restrictive interventions for those offenders who are most at risk for posing a threat to the community. This is the Adam Walsh Act tier system, which again includes juveniles as young as 14 and is predicated on offense classification. Would anybody else like to speak to that? California, New Jersey, or?
I think you covered it for us.
Okay.
New Jersey.
Okay.
Jill, can I jump in? Kelly Rose is asking a question. In New Jersey, are there any other counties that are being studied as Camden and Essex County was? Do you mind if I address that?
Please do.
Okay. The New Jersey Department of Corrections is pretty much the clearinghouse for a lot of the research that's taking place in this area, ultimately because we have access to the criminal histories of the sex offenders. So right now we're doing Camden County. We are going to look specifically at Camden City. We're also doing research with Cynthia Mercado from John Jay College and looking at her Newark data to join those databases. We also plan on taking sex offenders who recidivated, and Jill Levinson, myself, and Cynthia, taking sex offenders who recidivated, mapping them, and ultimately seeing where they live. So doing the research retrospectively versus prospectively, and ultimately looking to see where these offenders recidivated. So the short answer is, not to my knowledge, nobody else is doing other counties in New Jersey. So that is the short answer.
Okay, thank you. There were also some questions about these laws and how they apply to sex offenders in terms of victim preferences. And I think that most of us are probably aware that most victims of sexual child abuse are fairly well acquainted with their perpetrators. And so the Department of Justice, for instance, reported that only about 7% of child sexual abuse victims were assaulted by a stranger. 93% were molested by somebody who was known to them, including family members or offenders. Interestingly, in the recent Minnesota study, first authored by Grant Dewey from Minnesota Department of Corrections, where they looked at residential proximity, there were a couple interesting things that came out. One is that only 3.6% of the sex offenses against children were committed by neighbors. And so because residential restrictions really do target sex offenders who live within close proximity, very close proximity to children, that was pretty interesting that such a small percentage of those victim-perpetrator relationships were neighbors. Another thing that I think is interesting is that again, as you may know, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reports that there are somewhere between 100 and 150 stranger abductions of children, sexually motivated murders that occur from stranger abductions each year. So those events, thank goodness, are relatively rare events. And yet, these laws do tend to be predicated on those kinds of cases. So we know that children are much more likely to be sexually abused by members of their family, relatives, and again, the Minnesota study concluded that relationship proximity or social proximity was more of a risk to children than residential proximity. I'm also seeing some questions regarding sex offenders who target adults. Certainly the residential laws and to some extent community notification laws as well were predicated on the fear and the anxiety related to sexual abuse of children, and again in particular by unrelated people. And what has gotten lost in the translation to some extent is that adults also can be victims, of course, of sexual predators, and actually adults tend to be more likely, adult victims tend to be more likely to be severely injured or killed in sexually motivated crimes. And many of the state laws with regard to residence restrictions, and let's see if we can go back to this, to the map. We've got the poll. Okay, I will wait. But many.
We can actually. I don't want to interrupt your flow, so you can go back to the map if you want.
Okay, and then can we come back to this poll in a minute?
Absolutely.
Okay. When we look at the states that have residence restrictions, and again, keep in mind that these are only statewide laws, and they don't reflect the municipal ordinances, which many of the white states do have. About half of the states that have residence statutes, they apply only to sex offenders with minor victims, whereas and they don't apply to sex offenders with adult victims. So, for instance, in Florida, our laws and most of our municipal ordinances also apply only to sex offenders who had minor victims. Some of our municipal ordinances apply to victims under 16. But we do know that many sex offenders do target people of various age groups, and so that may not be a good gauge of knowing who might be a risk to a child or an adult in the future. Okay, Jim, we can go back to the poll. Okay.
Jill, and then I just want to remind you, it doesn't affect the recidivism laws, but what we did find with yours and my study was that the sex offenders who victimized adults did live closer to the hot spots than those who victimized children. It didn't have any relation to increased or decreased recidivism, but they did tend to live closer to those hot spots.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and some of the research that has mapped where sex offenders live it's been very inconsistent. Some studies have found that some have found that child molesters live closer to schools, and some have not found that. And it does seem as though residential choices appear to be driven more by practicality, right, namely income-related factors, than victim choice factors.
That's what we find in New Jersey. Greater accessibility to mass transportation, to treatment accessibility, and just living arrangements in general. So more about opportunity.
Okay. New poll. After searching your state's online registry, what did you do with that information?
Dr. Levinson, you can see I had to split this question up into two parts, but this should cover everything. There are the second one has the other two answer options with a both or neither option as well. So we'll be able to cover all four.
Okay, I'll give people a couple minutes to. Okay. And it seems as though what the limited research that's out there does show about this question is similar to what you all are suggesting, that many people, a majority of people have gone on to their onto their state's online registry, typed in their zip code, identified the sex offenders who lived nearby, but the majority of people do not necessarily change anything about their behavior. So that is a somewhat interesting finding, in that people do check the registry, but they don't really know what to do with that information. Very few people actually change their behavior. Would anybody else like to comment on that? Okay. Kristen, can you talk a little bit about your research on looking at the effectiveness of sex offender registration notification?
Sure. New Jersey was one of the first states to be given a grant from the National Institute of Justice. We were very lucky to be awarded. One of the first states to be able to study the efficacy of Megan's Law. As I'm sure you all know, Megan's Law originated at the state level in New Jersey and then went on in 1994 and then went on to be implemented at the federal level in 1996. So we had applied to the National Institute of Justice for funding to study whether or not Megan's Law was having an effect on decreasing recidivism in New Jersey. The first phase of our study included a trend analysis whereby we looked at sex offense rates in New Jersey from 1985 all the way up to 2005. So we charted sex offense rates through the Uniform Crime Reports using Crime in the United States for those 20 years. We looked at the 10 years prior to Megan's Law inception and the 10 years post Megan's Law inception. And what we found with this first phase, with this trend analysis, was that sex offense rates in New Jersey ultimately started going down or started decreasing in the early 1990s. We saw crime trends dropping in the early 1990s with our sex offense rates. So what we then did was we compared them to drug offense rates, and we looked at non-sexual offense rates. What we saw was a more dramatic dip with, or a decrease with sex offense rates compared to other types of crimes. Drug offense rates continued to increase. They were quite sporadic. The incidence was at a much higher level than obviously sex offending. We also saw a more decreased drop with sex offending compared to non-sex offense rates for those 20 years. The second phase of our study was a follow-up to that, the first being aggregate data for those 20 years and really providing a baseline measure of knowledge. The second phase was a random sample of sex offenders that we took for the 10 years prior to the Megan's Law inception and 10 years post Megan's Law inception in New Jersey. New Jersey has different facilities for sex offenders. We have something called the ADTC, which is the Adult Diagnostic Treatment Center, which is an incarceration facility in New Jersey, but it's also a mandated treatment facility. So sex offenders must fit 4 criteria in order to be incarcerated at the ADTC. They have to be repetitive, compulsive, and amenable and willing to be treated. So what we did was we took an even sample from the ADTC and the general population for all 20 of those years, so the 10 years prior and the 10 years post. We have a sample size of approximately 750 sex offenders for the second phase of the study. We'll be preparing to release the Phase 2 findings in the next few upcoming months. Our final report is due to NIJ, I believe the end of August or September. So Phase 3 is more of a cost-effectiveness analysis. What we attempted to do was look at how much it cost to New Jersey to implement Megan's Law from the very beginning in 1994 and ultimately see how that cost has evolved over the last 20 years. We surveyed all 21 prosecutors' offices. New Jersey is broken down into 21 counties. So we surveyed all 21 Megan's Law units in the prosecutor's offices to ultimately count up the cost of mailings, going and doing door-to-door notifications, looking to see how many employees the Megan's Law units employed, the computer systems, and ultimately how much the registries were costing, to see what that offset cost was. That's proving to be the most difficult aspect of this sort of three-phase study, surprisingly. What we thought would be the easiest is turning out to be the hardest. So, again, the final report is due to NIJ in September, so that will be released soon.
Okay, thank you. Somebody was also asking about looking at recidivism rates and tier levels, and one of our new grant-funded studies that we will be embarking on in the next few months will look at risk assessment procedures and their predictive ability in detecting recidivism here in the United States, including the Adam Walsh tiers.
That is something you and I also have on our agenda to study, which is the variances in recidivism based on tier levels for New Jersey sex offenders.
Thank you.
Jill, this is Julie. I was going to answer one of the questions in the queue if you'd like.
Please.
The question was, are there any distinctions in residency restrictions laws for an offender who has been designated a sexually violent predator versus one who does not have that designation? And again, that's going to vary state by state. In California, there are increased restrictions in terms of community notification and additional hearings. So when a sex offender is released from prison, if the county where that person will reside, such as San Diego, our office, the prosecutor, will, if they believe the person should not be let out, fight to keep that person at the state mental hospital. Once that person or the state hospital feels that the person is able to live on their own, another hearing will be had to release them into the community. And so it's a series of hearings and notifications, and in the last year or two we've had a couple where the community was in such an uproar. One of them was going to be placed in near one of our colleges, San Diego State University, and that was the hearing was held, community meetings, and the person was not placed there. In the end, we had 2 sexually violent predators placed in trailers, RV camper type, out on the state prison property, which is out in the southeast part of the county.
Thank you. Can the rest of the panel see all of the questions in the queue?
Yes.
I would like to open it up to the panel if there are any specific questions that you would like to respond to. While you're looking, I will just address a question from, looks like somebody here in Florida, saying that sex offenders actually target our city to live in when they learn we have no ordinance in place. Our sex offender population has more than tripled in the past 7 years. Is this a common trend for cities that do not have an ordinance? And this is one of the unintended consequences of local ordinances. They tend to have a domino effect of neighboring cities and towns passing equally or more restrictive ordinances to prevent exiled sex offenders from migrating to their communities. However, those cities or towns that elect not to enact local municipal ordinances may find that they become the only place where sex offenders can find housing, and that their sex offender populations do increase. So, in a way, it's almost like saying when municipal ordinances are passed, there is sort of this not in my backyard kind of motivation. But in a way, what that also says is that children in other communities are less important, because municipal ordinances or sex offender restrictions don't solve the problem of sexual violence. All they really do is displace that problem to other communities. Very often those are going to be poor or rural communities that actually have less resources with which to fight crime and protect their citizens. And so it may be those children in poor or rural communities who are probably more vulnerable and have more risk factors in some ways, and that's where the sex offender populations end up increasing. And so it is a sort of an interesting phenomenon, and we do have to, I think, collectively begin to look at the idea that all children everywhere are important, and that to gain some consensus about the most effective strategies to help children in every community would really be a worthwhile endeavor. Again, does the panel have any particular question that they would like to respond to?
So Lori Camden is asking ultimately about Internet predators, where the statistics fall into in terms of recidivism. New Jersey is one of the first states, I don't know if you've read in the newspapers, that was seeking to diminish rights of sex offenders to use the Internet, so sex offenders that were under parole or probation supervision. And of course, you know, it depended upon what initial type of sex offense they committed, but it would relinquish their right to use the Internet. Now, I don't know, her question's not too clear as to whether or not she's asking how we count Internet predators in terms of recidivism, or ultimately whether or not there's resulting legislation about it. There have been a few studies looking at Internet predators and sex offenders. Robert Prenke is currently conducting a grant-funded study in New Jersey and a number of other states looking at Internet predators. But there is a great deal of research out there on that subject that she could look up.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. There is also a question here about what measures are being taken to work with juvenile registrants who are reintegrating back into communities. They may be placed back with their families, and this is going to have a direct effect on the ability of the family to continue to live there and maintain stability. Julie, any stories from California about how they may be handling issues of juveniles and residence restrictions?
I'm going to plead the fifth on that one. I don't actually know the answer to that question, how juveniles are treated differently, if they are treated differently than adults in terms of that.
Okay. And again, this is a fairly new phenomenon, so I think that we are going to hear more about it as we go along and as we see states implementing the Adam Walsh Act. Any other questions? Tim, did you have any questions that you wanted to respond to?
No, I'm still reading through them. There was, let's see, where is it? Someone asked a question about the impact of forthcoming changes to Nevada law. My response is I'm not sure, and we'll have to see. And I'm sorry to be vague, but I'm reading through these and I can't find it again. I apologize to the person who posted it. There's the gist of it was asking about forthcoming changes to classification laws in our state and the impact that may have. And my answer is we're going to have to wait and see what the impact of that is. I'm unaware of any studies in other states that have looked at that that effect.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
One question here is there any evidence that a lack of residency options may be a cause of recidivism? And again, it's really pretty difficult to actually study that specific question. Do residence restrictions increase recidivism? However, I think that we can extrapolate from some of the criminal justice studies that we talked about a little while ago about transience and housing instability. We can extrapolate from that body of research that housing instability may be a risk factor for recidivism. And in terms of good criminal justice practice in general, and also specifically with sex offenders, what we know is that to help offenders reintegrate into communities successfully and to become gainfully employed and to have good law-abiding social supports, that those are the kinds of factors that are likely to prevent somebody from resuming a life of crime, and that laws that disrupt stability are going to increase the risk factors that we know may be related to resuming a life of crime. Okay. Well, at this point, I think that I would like to ask for closing comments from the panel. We only have about 10 minutes left, and I'm wondering if Julie or Kristen or Tim, if you have some closing thoughts.
Well, the only thing that I can think of is ultimately that we in New Jersey, or Jill and I, are planning on taking this research to a different level now and looking at those who recidivate and ultimately following up on some of the previous research that's been done on this topic to see whether or not once an offender does recidivate, would the residency restriction have ultimately impeded that recidivism. So that's where we do plan on going with this in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and there certainly is room for more study on the relationship between residential proximity and recidivism. And as somebody had asked, there was a question about looking at sex crime rates in jurisdictions that have these restrictions versus those that don't, and looking at the different ways that they either impede reintegration and may contribute to recidivistic behavior versus the ways that they may actually create protective factors for children. Julie, any final thoughts?
Sure. Again, I would just suggest that prior to implementing any new laws or ordinances, that jurisdictions, legislators, etc., look to any resources that they have in terms of planning ahead. How will this look if we implement it? What will the housing be like? Where are our schools and parks, etc., to make a more informed decision?
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. What I would like to add sort of builds on what Julie's talking about, especially for those responsible for making the assessment of residency restriction violations. I know anecdotally I spoke with someone responsible for assessing violations, and I said, how do you do it? A lot of times there is, I guess, a growing interest in using mapping and GIS to assess violations. And I asked this person, I said, how do you go about assessing risk? What's your procedures, your techniques? And it was to assess a 1,000-foot restriction, and he said, well, we just throw down a 2,000-foot buffer just to be safe. For folks who actually are doing this in practice, a very important consideration that underlies especially the use of GIS and mapping as an instrument to assess violation is techniques matter. In particular, how we put, if you will, dots on a map. Another good example is in the legislation that proposed the change in Florida from 1,000 feet to 2,500 feet. I think there was language in there about how exactly to go about assessing the distance, and the legislation talked about the distance shall be measured in terms of edge of parcel boundary to edge of parcel boundary. I think there needs to be a lot of attention paid to those types of technical issues, how the dots are put on the map, how the distance is determined. Given the impact that this has, method matters. So especially for those of you out there involved in the practice of assessing violation, special consideration needs to be given to that aspect of this.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, Jim, any closing thoughts?
Yes, Dr. Levinson, thanks. Let me just quickly congratulate the panel. This has been a fantastic event, and the majority of our events do not reach capacity as this one did. And I think you all covered a lot of ground, and we've certainly never had 50 questions posed during an event before. And by that I mean substantive questions, mixing the technical questions that we got to. So that is really impressive, and you answered so many of them. So thank you so much for that, panel. And what I'd like to do is just talk to the audience a little bit about what we can expect next. I will be following up with everyone who registered and/or attended to announce to you when the recording of this event is posted on our website. That should be, I would say, by Monday or Tuesday, the latest of next week. We'll also be posting the presenters' slides if we get their permission, and I'll be working that out with them over email after the event concludes. And remember, this is the first in a 4-part series, so we will be also contacting you as we schedule subsequent series in this online event series on sexual violence, so keep your eyes out for that. And finally, we have no slides to talk about this, but we do have a new groups tool in our portal, which I'm going to give you more details about over email. And this is going to be a great opportunity to carry on the discussion with other audience members in addition to the chat room, but to do so asynchronously. And it works through your email, and it's very easy to use, and there'll be more details on that. And we have, I need to make a quick announcement about the National Institute of Justice 2008 conference. They're still taking registrations for that. That's from July 21st to the 23rd. And you can go to NIJ's website. The address is up there. And from there you can find details about the conference. And as I mentioned, we are opening up a chat room for a virtual reception. The seating is limited here. There's only about 24 spots open, so it's first come, first serve. But I'm going to tell you how to get to that right now. And these are the instructions you're going to be following. But I'm going to actually simulate logging in through my own web browser. So you want to go to our homepage, www.innovations.harvard.edu. And on the home page, at the top right side of the screen, you should see a link that says Chat Room Reception, Residency Restrictions for Sex Offenders. Click on that. And in the following screen, you'll have a field where you can enter your name. Then click Sign In. And from there, you should be in our chat room. And you can begin chatting immediately with the other audience members that are in there. It'll probably take a few minutes for the room to fill up. And well, mine's still loading. But once you're in there, you can share URL links. So simply type in the URL address, and it becomes a link. You can upload files for other people to share. One of our panelists is gracious enough to join us for a little bit. And you can share pictures and exchange contact information before we close out. So it's a real good professional networking opportunity. And I'm going to leave those instructions up so that you all can get there. And I'll look forward to seeing some of you in there. And to everyone else, thanks again for making this event such a success.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.